Hi, this is Evan here, Molendinarius from latinum.org.uk, and in this little episode I'm going to be looking at this book. This is Attridge, The Well-Weighed Syllable, which I purchased recently. My copy came from the Kansas State College of Pittsburgh, Kansas, 66762. So Chapter 1 is of particular use and importance for if you're interested in the problems of reading Latin poetry out loud, which I am. You may have noticed that I tend to avoid it, and the reason for that is that I'm still not absolutely certain in my head how to go about doing it in a satisfactory manner. I've had some stabs at it, but there are all kinds of problems involved with Latin prosody that need to be resolved, and each person that reads Latin aloud will have to make decisions. So you will have to, you'll be forced to make some decisions about how you interpret the historical evidence and how you apply that in your performance Latin. So I'm going to go through chapter 1. It's not very long. It's long-ish, but not very long. And as the book is not easily accessible, and also this needs some interpretation, I thought it might be useful to go through it. It's a very important chapter. Now, the book itself is written on the premise, it's called The Well-Weighed Syllable, or Well-Weighed Syllables, actually, Elizabethan verse and classical meters, because in Elizabethan times in England, there was an attempt by English poets to write English poetry using classical meters, which then leads us to the question of how did the Elizabethans understand classical meter, and how did they then implement their understanding in their poetry. And we also have to have a look at the question of how they pronounced Latin, because the way they pronounced Latin affected how they read their Latin and how the whole thing fitted together. That's a separate issue, how Latin was pronounced in England during the Elizabethan period. We have, interestingly enough, one or two writers wrote down phonetic renditions of their Latin pronunciation. So we have a reasonably good idea of how it was pronounced. Anyway, problems of Latin prosody. Since, writes Attridge, we shall find in the succeeding chapters that the average educated Elizabethan had a very peculiar notion of what Latin meter was, it will be prudent to begin our investigation with a brief look at present ideas on the subject, if for no other reason than to forestall, by showing how many problems remain to be solved, any unwarranted feeling of superiority on the part of the 20th century reader. It will also be useful to give at the outset a sketch of what is known about Latin prosody, and to establish the senses in which some technical terms are to be used. The nature of quantity. Classical verse is based on an initial categorization of all syllables into two groups. These two types of syllables are arranged in predetermined patterns to make lines of verse. And the classification of syllables is not according to stress or accent, as in most English verse, but according to quantity. And one of the central questions around which much discussion has resolved and still revolves is simply, what is quantity? To those not accustomed to close examination of metrical and phonological matters, and this includes the Romans themselves, who were not advanced in these things. This is a relatively new science, the analysis of what's going on with your voice when you speak. And also many 20th century readers of Latin, as well as the Elizabethans. The traditional definition, which is interesting, it's still found in all the Latin textbooks I've ever looked at. The so-called traditional definition is universal in all Latin textbooks, even to this day. So the traditional definition explains everything in very simple fashion. Quantity refers to the duration of syllables. So we have a long syllable taking twice the time of a short syllable. So we have a short syllable and a long syllable. Right? A long syllable takes twice the time, and more or thereabouts in pronunciation. So lines of verse can be constructed with patterns like that, more or less, something along those lines. So patterns of longs and shorts. Now, says Attridge in one of his footnotes, because the English accent is, and the classical Latin in all probability was, a stress accent. And this is very interesting because Attridge, and you'll see the reasons why he says this, everyone says, well, Latin was not a stress-based language, it was only quantity-based, but this cannot be the case. Because if you don't read Latin verse with stresses in the right places, the whole thing falls to pieces. So Latin did have a stress accent, and with stress, of course, comes tone, because you can't have stress without a rise in tone. So he says he's tended to use these two terms interchangeably, except where it was necessary to distinguish between the prominence of one syllable over others, accent, and the particular method of achieving this prominence used in languages like English and German, which is stress. And he writes here that other problems posed by the nature of stress need not concern us, although it perhaps should be noted that pitch, duration, and intensity all play a part, probably in that order of importance. So pitch, duration, intensity. And pitch is definitely there, and some of the writers talk about the pitch being important as well. So let's go back to this thing. Quantity refers to the duration of syllables. A long syllable taking twice the time of a short syllable. So versus in pronunciation, so that lines of verse can be constructed with patterns or temporal rhythms of longs and shorts. And so Edwards, in the Eton Latin Grammar of 1826, and you'll find this pretty much repeated in modern Latin grammars. By quantity, then, we are to understand the time actually and practically devoted in the act of speaking to the enunciation of a syllable. Thus, a syllable uttered quickly, as to time, is said to be short, but a syllable uttered slowly is said to be long. Every 16th century grammar, and every modern Latin grammar actually, contains a similar definition, although without so much emphasis on what actually and practically occurred, which is a significant omission, as we shall see. And modern textbooks, as Attridge notes, also often assume that quantity is simply a matter of duration. The origins of this explanation of quantity are, of course, Greek and Roman. So Zirin, in 1970, gives a very useful survey of the statements by ancient grammarians and discusses two ways of looking at quantity that developed side by side. That of the so-called metrici. The metrici were concerned only with two kinds of syllables, short syllables and long syllables, and the rhythmici. The rhythmici were a group of poets and interpreters of poetry who, by assigning time values to the constituents of syllables, found a whole scale of durational values, not just long and short. But these two attitudes could not be reconciled. They are mutually exclusive. Since the arbitrariness of dividing the continuous durational scale into two could not be accounted for, and in fact, by adding up time units, some short syllables then emerge as longer than some long syllables, which is highly problematic. And although this contradiction in the durational theory suggests that long and short syllables are distinguished by some other criterion apart from syllable duration, none of the ancient grammarians went further than pointing out that there was a contradiction between these two ways of looking at poetry. And the Renaissance then inherited this ancient idea of quantity as something concerned purely with time. Now, this is a highly unsatisfactory theory, and if you have had a stab at reading any Latin poetry, paying attention to this duration theory of quantity, you will notice that it is unsatisfactory, that there are problems. And my instinct is that there are problems, and so I've held off from reading large amounts of poetry aloud until I've resolved the matter to my own satisfaction. I mean, I've read a bit here and there, but I'm not happy with the result. So these rules rely on a classification of every vowel as either long or short. However, since the difference between the two forms of a Latin vowel was one of quality as well as duration, and this is clearly also the case with the so-called long and short forms of English vowels, says Attridge, I prefer to use the terms tense and lax when referring to the phonetic properties of vowels in either language. And then he notes that a full description of the phonetic differences between tense vowels and lax vowels is given by Chomsky and Haller. But for present purposes, it will be sufficient merely to give some examples. So the vowels in bean, bane, balm, pawn, bone, boon are tense. And the vowels in bin, ben, bat, bun, pot, put are lax. So there's sort of a tension in the vowel. Bean, bane, balm, pawn, bone, boon. There's a tension there. And there's no tension in bin, ben, bat, bun, pot, put. And you can actually feel this around in the musculature around your mouth and lips. You can feel the difference between tense and lax when you're saying these words. And he's followed Chomsky and Haller, says Attridge, as regarding diphthongs as tense. So I, oi, and they feel tense. When you say them, you can feel the muscular exertion in your face, which is the equivalent of bracketing, he says, the long vowels or diphthongs in the traditional Latin grammarians' accounts of quantity and accent. Now, if we talk about tense vowels and lax vowels, then this has the advantage of leaving long and short free to be used of the classification of vowels for prosodic purposes, even when this classification bears no relation to the actual pronunciation of the vowels as tense or lax. So you can have we'll get to that later. So similarly, I shall use the terms heavy and light, following Allen, who talks about heavy syllables and light syllables, to refer to two kinds of syllable quantity that actually existed as a phonetic property in classical Latin, and then long and short to refer to two types of syllable distinguished on a theoretical level according to the rules of prosody, both in Latin verse and in English imitations of Latin verse. Whether or not there is a phonetic distinction in the pronunciation of the syllables. So we have a construction method and a pronunciation thing going on. The traditional account of quantity in Latin verse, which is still taught today in all schools, in all books, is in outline as follows. And here are the rules. A syllable containing a long vowel or a diphthong is a long syllable. So mos and y. A syllable containing a short vowel, that's short by nature, followed by a double consonant like x or z. Right, the letter zeta, the Greek letter zeta, was pronounced either zd or dz. We're not sure which. There's an argument, but it was a double letter. And x, the letter x is a double syllable. It's a k and a s together. X. So a short vowel followed by one of those gives rise to and then we have two consonants. These two consonants can be in the same word, or they can be in different words. So if a vowel is followed by two consonants directly, H being discounted is long. So for example, Knox. Knox is a metrically long syllable because x after the O, Knox. And the first syllable of culpa, culpa, because kul and then p follows, even though it's not in the same syllable. Culpa. The first syllable of et dona, because et, although it has one consonant, is followed directly by d of dona, et dona, and so that's a long syllable. This is true unless the consonant is a plosive. That's b, k, d, g, p, and t, which are the letters Bagad Kapat, if you want to remember them. Bagad Kapat. So the Hebrew grammarians listed the plosives in that way, with that mnemonic. So b, g, d, k, p, t, Bagad Kapat, just to help you remember. Followed in the same word, or in compound words, in the same part of a word, or by a liquid. A liquid is like a consonant that functions like a vowel because it flows, l and r. Right? These are not stops, but they are liquid. Right? You can imagine the L sound pouring out of a jug, l, and you can imagine the R sound pouring out of a jug, r. Right? In which case the syllable is short or it is long. So, for example, patrius, that first syllable can be short or long. So it can be patrius or patrius. And the poet has the option of including that r in the consonant cluster or not. Or the second syllable of ad lacrimo, the k followed by r. The poet has the option of treating the kr as a consonant cluster or of separating them and not treating them as a consonant cluster. But in ad lacrimo, the first syllable is long because it constitutes one part of a compound word, and that's a separate rule. All other syllables are short. Now, this is where it gets interesting. The Latin verse is complicated. It's not an easy subject. Syllables of type 1, which contain a long vowel by nature, so mos, y, these are traditionally described as being long by nature. And those of type 2, with a vowel that's short but the syllable is long because of the consonants, as long by position, but they have a short vowel. Now, it will be obvious that the theory of quantity as duration stems from these rules, especially if consonants are thought of as adding in some way arithmetically to the time taken for the pronunciation of a syllable. But if you read some Latin poetry according to these rules and put it into, say, Audacity, and then measure the lengths of the syllables, you'll find that this arithmetical thing, it's not what's actually happening. So something else is going on. Syllables that are long are not actually long in time. So this idea that we are adding arithmetically to the syllable in these ones that are long by position is a very problematic idea. And further consideration reveals problems. Though the common assumption is that two consonants take about the same time to pronounce as the vowel that they follow, and therefore they double the duration of the syllable, whereas a single consonant is not sufficient to increase the length significantly, and this is an assumption which is improbable in itself. And as I say, we can now measure it objectively by using software. It is difficult to explain why a long vowel or diphthong followed by two or more consonants, such as mens, is no longer than a long vowel or diphthong alone, such as me. So mens versus me. Moreover, how is one to explain the fact that consonants at the beginning of a syllable play no part in determining its quantity? And this is something that no matter how many consonants there are at the start of a syllable, the metrical rules ignore that completely, while consonants at the end are of crucial importance. So various attempts have been made to explain quantity in terms of duration from what is called syllable peak to syllable peak, or from syllable boundary to syllable boundary. But none of these attempts, these arithmetical objective attempts using software to look at the waveforms, etc., have succeeded in accounting for the details of the rules of Latin versification. So we have a problem. If you are a student of Latin and you want to understand what was going on, well, it looks like the Romans themselves didn't really understand what was happening. It doesn't mean that we can't understand it and that we can't read Latin poetry correctly, but the analysis by the Romans of what they were doing seems not to have been correct. It seems likely, therefore, that the distinction between long and short syllables in Latin was not simply a question of duration, but that there was a qualitative difference of some kind also involved. And the rules for ascertaining quantity are now often given in a form which relates much more closely to the phonetic character of the two types of syllable, and makes the inadequacy of the theory of quantity as duration even more apparent. And so if you look in Allen, the rules in this form depend on an initial procedure of syllable division, corresponding presumably to the divisions of syllables in spoken Latin speech, on the following principles. Of two or more consonants, at least the first one goes with the preceding vowel. So falsus, flamma, right? That's the normal rules of syllabification in Latin. Except in the case of a plosive plus a liquid within a word, when either the first consonant goes with the preceding vowel, or both consonants go with the following vowel. So we have either atrox or atrox. And that, sorry about the noise, it looks like somebody's doing some work upstairs. I'm not going to pause this, so we might have a bit of disturbance. Using the phonetic terms instead of the traditional ones, and referring to a syllable that ends in a vowel as an open syllable, and one that ends in a consonant as a closed syllable. So if we do that, then we can change our definition of quantity and restate it. A closed syllable or an open syllable with a tense vowel is heavy, while an open syllable with a lax vowel is light. I'll repeat that. A closed syllable or an open syllable with a tense vowel is heavy, while an open syllable with a lax vowel is light. And this is on page 11. Various theories of quantity have been proposed, which attempt to find an alternative to duration as the most important difference between light and heavy syllables. So Jakobson, writing in 1960, suggested it's a matter of simpler and less prominent syllables opposed to those that are more complex and prominent. And the notion of prominence as the distinguishing characteristic is a more useful one than duration. But, writes Attridge, complexity does not seem sufficient to account for it. And then we have a writer called Marozzo, writing in 1954 and 1955, who had a theory which proposes as a basis for the distinction between heavy and light syllables something which he called suspension, which occurs when consonants succeed one another. But he does not solve all of the problems with his analysis. And then this is quoted in Zirin. But he does at least not feel obliged to prove that heavy syllables were markedly longer than light ones. Writers on the classical languages tend to emphasize that habits of English speech can only obstruct our understanding of quantity, since it is a foreign phenomenon to the nature of English. And this is something which I've read and I've taken on board, but I may have to review this as well. This is emphasized all the time by speakers of Latin, and it's used to justify this monotonous speaking of Latin where there's no stress at all, and it sounds like someone is speaking in their sleep like this, and they really don't go up and down very much, and it sounds like they are speaking at a funeral. Right? Now, and I believe that this way of speaking Latin is derived from this understanding, which is also repeated in all the traditional grammar books, that Latin was not at all stressed-based. So this idea that it's a foreign thing to Latin, and so let's look at Chomsky and Haller, 1968. In their analysis of the rules governing stress placement in English, arrive at some conclusions which suggest a close connection between the phonology of English and the phonology of Latin. Now, if this were the case, that's extremely interesting and very useful to a reader of Latin, as if the phonology of the two languages, how the stress clusters and the lax clusters of syllables work, if they work in the same way in the two languages, it perhaps is not necessary to alter one's pronunciation overly much. So they suggest a close connection between the phonology of English and Latin. They refer to a lax vowel followed by one or no consonants as a weak cluster, and they contrast this with what they call a strong cluster, consisting of a tense vowel followed by one or no consonants, or of a vowel, either tense or lax, followed by two or more consonants. And they then state their first approximation to a stress rule for verbs as follows. Primary stress is placed on the penultimate syllable if the final syllable terminates in a weak cluster, and a final strong cluster receives primary stress. This structure, notes Attridge, of strong clusters and weak clusters corresponds exactly to what we have in Latin, which is the structure of heavy syllables and light syllables. Now, Chomsky and Haller's definitions, notes Attridge, do not apply to syllables after syllable division, but they apply to strings of phonological elements within a word. And so theirs is closer to the older account of quantity in Latin, interestingly enough. And the role of these strong and weak clusters in determining stress placement in English is very close to that of heavy and light syllables in determining the position of the accent in Latin, where the accent occurs on the anti-penult if the penultimate is light. So we have dominus, dominus, where the accent is on the anti-penult because the penult is light. So dominus, dominus. This is a paroxytone word. But it will fall on the penultimate if it is heavy, honestus. This is a paroxytone word, honestus. Now, when Chomsky and Haller refine their definition of a weak cluster, then the parallel becomes even more exact, since they allow an optional R and Y and W, and sometimes L after the consonant. And then Attridge notes that if you want to have a look at this in more detail, you should look at Stetson, 1945, page 48 to 59, for an analysis of the physiological mechanisms involved in stress, which has close affinities with this phonological account of Chomsky and Haller. It seems, writes Attridge, to be justifiable to conclude that what is traditionally called quantity is not so much a matter of syllable duration as of syllable structure, although it is a conclusion which has yet to be widely accepted, and that the differences of structure, according to which syllables are classified into two groups, are not arbitrarily chosen features or variations in complexity, but they are fundamental, basic, essential differences, often closely linked with the operation of stress, and they are found in languages which on the face of it appear to have very little in common. And then he writes that the most valuable discussion of accent and quantity in Latin on these terms are those of Allen and of Zirin. And Zirin, he writes, concludes that quantity in general, then, was a more complicated matter than the ancient grammarians realized. It is not based upon a system of time values at all, but rather on a distinction of two syllable types and a ratio of equivalence between them, which, though it appeared to be basically durational, is only secondarily so, and finds its real basis in the relation between syllable and accent in the deeper morphophonemic structure of the language. And Attridge notes that such an account of quantity, although it avoids many of the common errors, by no means solves the problem of its use as a basis for verse. And this is the problem at its crux. Writes Attridge, we do not know how the difference between heavy and light syllables was actually perceived. In other words, we just don't know. And so some people are extremely critical about the way various people read Latin poetry. And we don't know enough to be able to be certain of these things. That it was referred to in terms of syllable length need not have any significance. Untrained users of a language are notoriously inaccurate in describing its phonetic detail, and the Roman use of long and short may be no more accurate a reflection of the true nature of their language than their use of tonal terms to describe their accent seems to have been accurate. Presumably, heavy syllables were somehow felt to be more prominent than light syllables. But whether this was because they received more stress, especially when in important positions in verse, or whether their difference in structure itself was somehow perceived, is a question which has not yet been satisfactorily answered. The reading of Latin verse. And this section I will deal with in a separate little talk, and talk about metrical beats and things like that. It's quite an important subject in terms of someone like myself who's interested in the performance aspects of Latin poetry, and there are a few of us knocking around out there in the world, and I'll go through it step by step. Vale.